Hello, this is Sharon Terry from Genetic Alliance, and welcome to our series on the massive measures. We've been working on this series throughout the year, and it will continue actually for several more months. We're delighted to have our guest today. Before we begin, we want to just give you a couple of pieces of information that will be helpful to you, the audience. There are a lot of you. What we do is we mute all of you because it's too many people for us to be able to have speak at once. And so in lieu of being able to ask questions out loud, we're going to ask you to type them into the box that is part of the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you look over on the right, usually the right-hand side of your screen, there's a floating palette, and there's a box there for you to type your questions into. This is a recorded webinar. When you came in, you probably heard this was recorded. That means that the recording of the presentation, the slides themselves, and the answers to any questions that we do get and are answered after the presentations are all available to you after. You may share them, you may pass them on, whatever you wish. But again, we are recording the webinar, and the slides will be available through our website, through an archive. And so without further ado, we're going to begin. But before I introduce our speakers, we actually are going to have a little poll for you. And this is our first time trying this poll. So I will ask our technology person, Jeff, to poll. Okay, so you'll see on your screen a question. Have you ever applied for PCORI funding? And you should select yes or no, and then press the submit button, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. The next question popping up on your screen: do you plan to submit an application for PCORI funding in the future? And this time your options are yes, no, and not sure. So click one of those buttons and then click submit. Panelists, these are going to be grayed out for you. They're just for the audience. And the last question: have you read, or as one of our speakers suggested, scanned or looked at the PCORI Methodology Standards or Methodology Report? Select either yes or no and press submit. And then Jeff is going to do some kind of magic that will give us the results of the poll. Okay, so have you ever applied for PCORI funding? 33% of our now 58 or so attendees, yes, and 67% no. Next question. Do you plan to submit an application for PCORI funding in the future? 55% said yes, 7% said no, and 39% said not sure. And then the last question. Have you read the PCORI Methodology Standards or Methodology Report? 61% said yes, very good, and 39% said no. After today, you will be familiar with it, and you'll just be dying to read it. Okay, we're going to start our webinar, and I'm going to start with a small introduction. Again, this is Sharon Terry from Genetic Alliance. This is recorded, and so you'll be able to see it and get the slides from the website. And our presenters today are going to talk to you about the PCORI Methodology Report. I was extremely excited by this report, and I read a lot of reports, and usually I'm not very excited by them. And as I said to our speakers at the beginning, I actually read it about 10 times, and I annotated it and gave it to our whole staff as essentially a crash course in methodology that's really patient-centric, participant-centric, really very wonderful report. I think what's so good about it is it's very accessible, and it, again, is very much participant-centric, the kind of thing that Genetic Alliance really likes to see, and a very good job of writing it overall. So today we're going to have 3 speakers present this report to us, and they will go in this order, and I'll introduce them all right now, and then we'll proceed to their presentation. They'll speak about a half an hour or so, and then we'll have time for questions. Again, feel free to ask questions at any time. Just type them into your box, and I'll collect them during the webinar. So first, we're going to hear from David Hickam, who's the Program Director, Clinical Effectiveness Research at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is PCORI. Then we'll hear from Robin Newhouse, who's Chair and Professor of Organizational Systems and Adult Health at the University of Maryland School of Nursing. And finally, Steve Goodman, who's a Professor of Medicine at Stanford University. So I'm going to turn it over now to you, David.
Yes, thank you. I just want to mention that Robin Newhouse is the chair of the PCORI Methodology Committee, and Steve Goodman is the co-chair, and they have been involved with PCORI really from the very beginning when PCORI first started, and provided important leadership in ushering through the process of the development of the initial slate of PCORI methodology standards and the 2 versions of the PCORI Methodology Report. I'm going to just give some background. I think most of the people on the webinar know something about the history. PCORI is a new organization. It was created through a provision in the Affordable Care Act, and as is summarized, this slide gives some language from the original legislation that created PCORI. But the purpose of PCORI is to assist patients, clinicians, purchasers, and policymakers in making informed health decisions. And we're going to talk for a few minutes about just what that means, but it essentially means that we develop a program of clinical comparative effectiveness research and some related activities, including sort of evidence synthesis and synthesis of research findings, and developing effective methods for getting good clinical evidence into the hands of healthcare decision makers, which includes patients, patient families, caregivers, and the clinicians that those patients and caregivers interact with. So one thing that PCORI does really keep front and center is the importance of the clinical information that people need. PCORI's mission is to help people make informed healthcare decisions and to improve the delivery and the outcomes produced by the healthcare system. And PCORI places an important emphasis that the research is guided by the patients and the healthcare community that the evidence will directly affect. And so PCORI has a variety of ongoing activities to engage people like you in our activities. We have an active process of prioritizing areas of research, and we invite input from individuals and from organizations to bring forward to us the topics that you think are important. We have a unique merit review system for reviewing applications for research funding, in which half of our merit review panels are patients and stakeholder members, the other half being the scientists that are the usual members of such panels. So we have an interdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder process of reviewing applications. We have an ongoing, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, effort to make sure that the design and methodology of the research projects that we support are high quality, and there are opportunities for you, the community, to bring your best ideas to help us guide the development of our standards and guideline process for helping to guide research. And we're going to fill you in today about sort of where we stand with our current methodology standards, but want to make sure that you understand that this is an ongoing process in which we will be updating and adding new standards as we go along. And finally, we want you to tell us how we're doing and how PCORI is performing. And so we have an active outreach activity to evaluate PCORI's programs and get input from you in how we can improve, our programs and our activities. So as I mentioned, PCORI has, a primary purpose to develop a program of comparative clinical effectiveness research. And just to say a few words about what this is research that is emphasizes developing new evidence that's useful for patients. We want to look at every single project that we support and make sure that there's good clarification of the questions that matter to patients and other clinical decision makers, so that the research project is well aligned and defines well the questions that are being answered. We stress that the projects examine outcomes. These are both the benefits and harms of comparative treatments that matter to patients, that are important. What are the benefits and harms that are important to people, and how can we fill the important evidence gaps to get better evidence about the probabilities of the benefits and harms of alternative clinical interventions. And finally, to pay attention to how the findings from these research projects can be implemented and used effectively in clinical care environments. And so one way to think about this work is that the research, the patient-centered outcomes research that we support, helps people to answer questions. And these multicolored boxes on this slide are some of the questions in a very generic way that the research that PCORI supports can help provide better answer to these questions. So given people's personal characteristics, notice the emphasis on kind of the heterogeneity of the patient populations. What can patients expect will happen to them as they pursue management options through the healthcare system? What are those options? What are, in fact, the meaningful different approaches that can be taken for managing any healthcare problem? This is the comparative aspect of the research, of emphasizing how that we have clarity about which options are most important and how we can get better evidence about those options. How can people understand the trade-offs between benefits and harms so that they can improve the outcomes that are most important to them? And finally, how can we use this evidence in the best possible way? How can the healthcare delivery systems and the clinicians that work in those systems help people to make the best decisions and the best choices? So we're always sort of going back to this focus on trying to improve and optimize patient outcomes. And just to say, in terms of trying to sort of put this into place, one of the latest things that we've been doing at PCORI is to really think about meaningful studies that are pragmatic. And so we have started to emphasize this terminology. So what is a pragmatic comparative effectiveness research study? Well, it's a study that assesses whether two or more options differ in their effectiveness when administered in real-life settings and in practical, everyday healthcare delivery systems. That the project is conducted in a clinical setting that is as close as possible to the real-world environment. And finally, that the methodological approach to the study, including its design, the outcomes that are used, and the follow-up, are as simple as possible, so that the study kind of represents the reality of the clinical situation in which people are receiving care. And so we're trying to emphasize this trade-off about keeping the study simple without sacrificing the scientific rigor of the study. And we're doing some work, and I think the methodology standards help speak to the efforts to make these studies more pragmatic and useful. And so that was all I was going to say, and I would like to turn over the microphone to Robin Newhouse, a professor at the University of Maryland, to talk specifically about the PCORI methodology standards and the methodology report.
Thank you, David. I'll cover a snapshot of the origin of the methodology report, a little bit about the legislation, and introduce you to the methodology standards that were published last year. So the first question is, why do methods matter? The goal of PCORI, as David discussed, is to develop studies that are of high quality. In that case, methods matter. The second goal is to quickly translate the evidence to practice. A second reason why we have to have trustworthy results. Methods matter because If we have better methods, we'll produce more valid, trustworthy, and useful information that leads to better healthcare decisions and ultimately to improvement of patient outcomes. So when we think about methods, we're thinking about the designs that we use and the choices and the trade-offs that we make and which designs we choose, the focus of our approach, which data we decide to collect, which measures we decide to use. So when we think about the methods, our focus is both design and the methods that we use in our research approaches. Just to introduce you to the legislation specifically called for the appointment of a methodology committee. And the legislation stated the Institute shall establish a standing methodology committee to develop and improve the science and methods of comparative clinical effectiveness research, what we fondly called patient-centered outcomes research. So the role of the methodology committee was twofold in the statute. Our first job was to make recommendations in terms of methods to be used through methodology standards. The second was the creation of a translation table. So these standards that were created in this first report provide guidance about the appropriate use of the methods in patient-centered outcomes research. Another opportunity for the methodology committee was to help establish the priorities to address some of the gaps in research or methods that are used in the approaches to patient-centered outcomes research. So the Methodology Committee of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute started its work in 2011. And our goal was by May of 2012 to create the first set of methodology standards that would guide the methods used in patient-centered outcomes research that would be funded by PCORI. The PCORI Methodology Committee focused on areas of minimal standards in which the standards could do the most good in framing what methods should be included in the studies that PCORI funds. The approach to developing the methodology standards was highly engaging. So the Methodology Committee reviewed the final standards and was responsible for the development of the report in collaboration with the PCORI staff, including David. But the first step was to identify where are those areas that we could make the biggest impact to the methods. So the first job was for the committee to work in groups to identify and prioritize the major methods areas for standards development. Then we identified these areas and posted a call for contract, a PCORI funding announcement, and contractors submitted proposals to synthesize the evidence around these different types of standards. They provided information about the theoretical and empiric basis for the standard, about how the standard was used at that time and how different these standards were in practice. They provided linkages to examples of standards that were applied in these contractor reports. These contractor reports are also publicly available on the PCORI website if you'd like to see them. So we, as the PCORI Methodology Committee, did not complete these reports or this work. What we did is we synthesized this work into standards, and it was a highly interactive relationship with those that contracted to help us with this first set of standards. In addition, we worked on development of a translation table, and Steve will introduce you to the translation table that provides the timeline and the flow of generating a question, choosing a design, and completing the results. And that translation table was to help the PCORI board make some decisions about what types of studies would be appropriate for what types of research questions that were generated. That translation table was posted publicly, and there was a request for information where we solicited comments so that those comments were then incorporated back into the translation table that you see in the methodology report. So first we generated the methods that would be most important. Second, we worked with the external public and contractors around generating the standards. At the next step, there was internal review, where the methodology committee members reviewed and deliberated on each standards, and we either came to consensus or rejected a standard that was not ready to be included in this first set. And then the second thing that was incorporated was the public comments on the methodology standards. Methodology standards were posted publicly. There were over 1,000 comments returned. Those comments were reviewed and included in the final methodology report, as well as the request for information comments that came back to us, and they were incorporated into changes in the translation table. Then the report was generated. It was provided to the PCORI board in May of 2012. As I mentioned, it was posted for public comment. The comments were reviewed, and then the final report was adopted in December of 2013 by the Board of Governors, at which time it became the document that guided the methods that would be used in the PCORI funding. So now if you have submitted a proposal recently, you'll see that there are linkages to required compliance with these methodology standards. So that just gives you a little snapshot of how these methodology standards were developed. And just to say that these are the first set of standards, and there are obviously many standards that apply to this kind of work. And Steve will certainly close and talk about ways that you can engage in recommending standards that should be considered in some of the methodology committee work as we move forward. So the standards that are included in the methodology report are cross-cutting standards, and some of them are standards for specific designs. In the report, there are 47 individual methodology standards. Those cross-cutting standards apply to all studies submitted to PCORI, formulating research questions, standards for patient-centeredness, standards for data integrity and rigorous analysis, preventing, handling missing data, and heterogeneity of treatment effects. You'll also notice that there's standards specific on design, such as data networks, data registries, adaptive and Bayesian trial designs, causal inference, studies of diagnostic tests, and systematic reviews. So these standards form the first set of methodology standards. So I've given you a high-level introduction of how the standards were created and an introduction to the domains of standards that are included in the report. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Steve Goodman, who will discuss some of the specifics of the standards a little farther.
Okay, thank you, Robin. So the first thing we just want to say is we tried to make standards that were reasonable, that weren't overly onerous to meet, and that virtually the whole research community could agree upon. So this is why we call them minimal standards. They're not necessarily the very, very best methodology that could be used in every case, which we didn't aim for because it's a constantly shifting target. The best methodology changes frequently because we're always improving methodology. But we wanted to be able to say that certain basic rules and principles in the use of these research methods were done right. So they're minimal standards. They were supposed to provide guidance both to those who do the research and those who interpret the results, reflect currently accepted best practices, again, not necessarily the very best because that's up to the researchers, but certainly the best practices for what is considered, the basic principles of sound research, that they are guidance both for conduct and reporting, that they could also be used to assess the application. So for those of you who have applied or are applying, certainly we want you to pay attention. And that the standards are used in the context of the project that's being done, and that they involve engaging stakeholders, and that all tests and scales used are validated, and that plans for data analysis correspond to major aims. I mean, these are the kinds of principles that one would think you'd hardly have to articulate, but we try to spell them out here. So this is an example of the standards for those of you who haven't already looked at them. This is the standard for selecting study participants who are representative of the population of interest. And I'll just read through some of this. I won't read every word. It says, research proposals and subsequent study reports should describe, 1, the plan to ensure the representativeness of participants, 2, how they're identified, selected, and recruited, and enrolled and retained, 3, efforts to maximize adherence, and 4, methods used to ensure unbiased and systematic data collection. So you see here it's almost a reporting standard. We're not telling them exactly how to do this, but we're asking every applicant to tell us how they're going to do each of these things. And these are often areas that simply don't get sufficient attention in many protocols. And then we have a section after this that has to do with hard to recruit or hard to identify populations. This is a different kind of standard. It's a much more technical standard related to missing data. Again, this is the kind of thing you would hope that every researcher would know about, but the fact is that many researchers either don't know about the methods for missing data, or they don't tell us what they know. So the first standard here is simply describe the methods to prevent and monitor missing data. And the first sentence is perhaps the most important. Investigators should explicitly anticipate potential problems of missing data and parenthetically, and to plan for them. The study protocol should contain a section that addresses missing data issues and steps taken in study design and conduct to monitor and limit the impact of missing data. And then it goes on with a little bit more detail. So the most important heads up in the first standard related to missing data is simply think of it ahead of time, plan for it, tell us how you're going to deal with it. The third standard under this heading is use validated methods to deal with missing data that properly account for statistical uncertainty due to missingness. A lot of sort of ad hoc methods that people use is simply throwing out subjects that don't have complete data, or putting in a single value for a missing data element, a best guess, a mean. These are not proper methods. And the scientific community, statistical community in particular, has a set of validated methods that take into account the fact that if the data is missing, you're going to be very uncertain about any number you put in there. So this is very, very standard in the field, and we want to make sure that all our researchers use the proper methods. And I will say that missing data in the comparative effectiveness world is particularly important because since we're trying to do research in real-world settings, you can expect that there are going to be problems, more problems than in a very rigidly controlled clinical trial, because life happens in the real world and patients don't come back, measurements don't get taken, and so missing data and properly dealing with it is extraordinarily important, and this is one of the reasons why we highlighted this. This is the standards for adaptive and Bayesian trial designs. Adaptive designs are designs that whose conduct or plan modifies in response to the data. So in other words, if you see a larger than expected effect, you might stop the trial early, or you might drop an arm, or you might even potentially change an endpoint. So we're not seeing many of these proposed right now. We put this in here for two reasons. First of all, we wanted to signal that PCORI was open to these sort of more novel designs. Hopefully they won't seem as novel in the future, but right now they are. And so it was a sort of an ad for welcoming this sort of design to PCORI. The second part is that because they're rarely used, we really thought that our own reviewers, no less potentially the researchers, could be a bit at sea in knowing how to evaluate these designs. So these standards are both a signal to the researcher community about that we're welcome, that these are welcome, this is how to do them, and to our own reviewers about here are the guidelines that you should use in assessing them. So you will see here that the first standard, and these are particularly comprehensive standards because this is a sort of newish area. This is the first standard, says specify planned adaptations in primary analysis, and which is perhaps the most important principle of adaptive designs, is that they're not simply that you just start doing the trial and you can change the way you wish, but you have to foresee all the possible changes in design that might occur, all the planned adaptations. And it says it should be prospectively planned, the design clearly documented, including all potential adaptations, including timing, trial results and populations that will be used in determining each adaptation, the statistical models to be used, the planned analysis of the primary endpoints, and then it goes on in more detail. So that's the standards for adaptive invasion trial designs. For those of you particularly interested in this, I would strongly encourage you to go to the report and read through it. It's actually a superb summary of the basic principles underlying these and how they should be adhered to. One thing that we are really extremely proud of is it was an effort led by Mark Helfand on the committee and Dave Hickam, who you've already heard from, is to ally these sort of technical standards that we've just shown you and wrap them embed them within a context that shows why patients should care about them. And so we have lots and lots of examples to make, in a sense, these highly technical standards come alive and explain why people should care. And when you read the report, if you do look at it, it really reads like no other statistical report, because you will see it wrapped in stories about, a particular study or the way a study could use them to inform patient choices. That's under the CER wins banner here. Then through the prism of a patient who is making their own choices and who has experienced the results of a particular treatment, then how these standards and issues are encountered in the conduct of research, and then finally on the stories about research that made a difference. And so I think this is really unique, and is what we think shows how different PCORI is trying to be than other folks who have gone into this area, and we're very, very interested in any feedback that any of you would have if you look at this. So because we're trying to bridge the gap between the things that people do in medical research and the experiences that patients have at the other end. This is an example of how we try to highlight the importance of issues regarding missing data in the conduct of research. So this focuses particularly on a story of a particular patient who was enrolled in a trial who basically, for a variety of reasons, decides to discontinue follow-up appointments. And it sort of tracks how the researcher might talk to the patient and explain how critical their information is to the study, and if that can be useful in retaining patients in the future. Many patients are not really aware how valuable their information is, even if they stop taking the therapy in question. It's very, very important to separate the issue of, in a sense, participating in the study that is accepting the treatments in the study versus just giving follow-up information at the end of the day. because patients deciding to discontinue a therapy is what happens in the real world. We're measuring the effect of that just as we're measuring the effect of therapies themselves. And if we don't know what happens to you if you're taking that or you've decided not to, at the end of the study, and sometimes this can be as simple as making a phone call, it doesn't necessarily even require a clinic visit, that very much weakens the study. So this links the standards with regard to missing data to the actual interactions that a researcher might have with a patient who is not following up anymore. The translation table is interesting. It was put into the legislation, I think, in many ways, hoping that we would provide a guide to policymakers to tell them, what's the best design for any given question. We, in our efforts to respond to this, we encountered the same problems that any good researchers encounter, which is that there's really no particularly best design to address a given question. Every design, every study involves a series of trade-offs. What we did instead of doing something like that is we developed a set of principles, a framework that we hoped would be helpful in understanding how certain designs are chosen and what the trade-offs are. So we have 4 principles here in design choice. One is to keep the research, actually this is missing a word, keep the research question and the methodology separate. The research and methodology are obviously similar, so it's to pose a question that isn't driven by what you can do, but to pose the question clearly, and then you have something to compare against the design that you chose, and you can say, does this methodology and does this design really address that question? That is often something that's not done well. To clarify the trade-offs, every study design choice involves trading off, sample size versus representativeness versus precision. There are lots of things that you trade off, and often these are not made explicit, and that's something we're encouraging be done. Third thing is understand that there's no research study that is not in the context of research studies that have been done in the past and studies that might be informed in the future, so that all studies should take advantage fully of what's been done before and with an eye towards what needs to be done. And finally, try to use the best methodology possible. So this is what we call our translation framework, and it's a very, very complicated slide. I'm not going to go through every arrow and category here, but I'll just focus on 2 areas. One is under the in the lower right where it says prioritize study characteristics. There are qualities to the study, that is internal validity, that is how accurately it measures a measure of effect in the context and in the population where it's being done. External validity, which is to what extent that result can be taken and transported elsewhere. Is it going to be true for other contexts, other populations, other dose regimens, et cetera? Precision, which is how precise the answer is. It's a reflection of sample size. Heterogeneity, does it have an adequately representative population? Does it explore different effects and subsets? Ethical considerations, et cetera. And then we have extrinsic. Those are all things you can look at just by looking at the study design, but then you have to consider things like how quickly do you need the study done? How difficult is it going to be to do? What sort of data are available to do this? And so often these considerations are pitted against each other, and you have to prioritize. You have to say what matters the most. If you need the result in a year, that's going to trump. That's going to say, well, maybe we can't do a randomized control trial. That may trump everything else. So making clear what the constraints are, what are the highest priorities, is one of the first steps towards picking a optimal study design in context. And then in the lower left, specifying the elements, we have all the the components of a proper research question that have to be specified to have a good design. In the upper left-hand corner, we have 3 elements that are often, again, ignored because they exist. They're part of the context, which is being very complete about articulation of the prior evidence, articulate the intent of the research and the decisions to be informed. This is what makes comparative effectiveness research, or PCOR, in a sense, I don't want to say different, but its emphasis different than other research, is that the decision is upfront, and if the research doesn't address the decision to be made, then you have to adjust the research. And finally, to incorporate stakeholder perspectives in a meaningful way. So next steps, the Methods Committee is continuing to work to improve the field of methods in many ways, certainly by disseminating and implementing this report, looking at our portfolio for areas where we might need further methods guidance, developing new standards, and that's where all of you can come in, and convening experts and hosting workshops on key methods topics, of which we've had many over the past 3 years. And we're always entertaining ideas for new ones and looking for participants, particularly patients, to join us. I would say that the involvement, I will just give one example of this. We had a workshop very early on in PCORI related to research networks. We invited a broad array of folks, including many research patient research groups, and it was out of that meeting that we have now the patient-powered research networks that are part of the building the national infrastructure for research. So the patient participation in these workshops makes a big difference, and we will welcome all of you being involved as we go forward. So this is a slide, and you can get all of these. They'll be stored on how you can get involved. These are the links for proposing new method standards topics, and of course you can write to us, the Methodology Committee specifically, and we will get your messages and on virtually any topic, and again, we welcome your input. So I think the floor will be open for questions.
Yes, very good. Thanks very much to Steve and David and Robin. Great overview of my favorite report. We have a couple questions, and again, we invite you. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so feel free to type them into the question box, and I will ask them to the speakers in some quasi-logical order. So the first one, can you comment on the response you're getting from those preparing studies that are not destined for PCORI oversight or support? So for example, outside the PCORI community, what has been a reaction from the larger community, perhaps people seeking NIH or other NSA, NSF, studies, that sort of thing?
Well, I'll try to answer that. Well, I can't really answer it. I'm going to pass it on to any of the fellow panelists. We do think, because no other funding agency has, articulated methodology standards like this, that we expect these to sort of almost by default have an impact on the way research is done. The NIH obviously doesn't have stuff like this, and basically no one does, and it's a reflection of the unusual composition of PCORI that they put a methodology committee right up there at the top of the governance of the organization, along with the board of directors. These are the only two legislatively mandated committees. So we think that it will have an impact on the community, but we think that diffusion will be slow. But we do think it will happen, as I say, almost by default. I have not heard specifically of this indirect impact, and nor have we assessed it so far. I mean, we're still very, very early on. We may find that over many, many years, but maybe David from PCORI or Robin has some insights on this.
So I think, Steve, you answered from the broad perspective of the standards influencing others or the way others fund. I'm going to answer just from the reaction of investigators that haven't been in the patient-centered outcomes research world. And that's the response of individual investigators that often when we speak with them about PCORI or the methodology standards, some of the standards are, as Steve said, minimal standards, and they've seen them before, missing data, for example. But one of the things that they often ask about is the requirement for patient engagement. So many of the investigators that have done trials in the past haven't necessarily engaged people in generating the questions, in choosing the designs, in selecting the methods, or engage people throughout the trajectory of our research from the conceptualization to the dissemination. So many times the interaction is around, what does this mean to me, and how are investigators achieving this goal of patient engagement? So I'd say that's one of the biggest questions I get from the community, and David may have some other, I'm sure that he gets queries as well.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I would point out that AHRQ has directly referenced the methodology standards in some of their funding announcements that have come out within the last 12 months. And so they're, PCORI has had a close partnership with AHRQ and the NIH, with actual staff members from those two organizations serving on the Methodology Committee as well as the PCORI Board of Governors. And AHRQ has embraced the standards and is starting to use them in their funding announcements. And so I think we're starting to see the diffusion of these standards out into other organizations.
Terrific. Thanks very much. The next question, when looking at the report, it seems to require, of course, a lot of statistical work, requiring certainly people with skills around that. And does PCORI think that the statisticians that would be required to do this sort of work should be highly specialized and a rare breed, or do they also see some of this capacity or skills starting to be integrated more broadly into the community, where community researchers and even patient advocacy groups might have access to that those skills themselves?
Boy, that's it's an interesting question. I wish I could have a back and forth with the questioner. These principles, as we said, are sort of minimal standards, and if one is going to be doing research, some member of the research team needs to have these skills. Some of them are technical and statistical, but if you're doing a study that requires statistical analysis, of which almost everything we fund will, some member of the research team needs to know enough about it to both design and analyze the study with these skills. I would say that if you don't have a member of your team with these skills and you require them for your report, then it's not likely that your application will be approved. It does have to have a certain degree of scientific rigor. That said, just like we want scientists to engage with patients and the patient community, if the questions are being generated through patient networks, we want them to engage with scientists as well, sort of reciprocal partnership. So if that means finding statisticians to work with, and most of these are not highly specialized skills in the statistical community. They're sort of bread and butter statistical principles. So the vast majority of statisticians who've done research should not find these principles particularly challenging. So it's really just hooking up with someone who is expert enough so the study can be regarded as one that will supply a meaningful answer, and we think everybody has an interest in doing that. I don't know if the others on the phone have their own take on this.
No, I think you answered it completely, but just would like to note that even on the methodology committee, Sharon Lee Norman was on the committee and then rotated off this year, and now Sally Morton serves. So we actually have a biostatistician on the methodology committee, but I don't have anything else to add, Steve, to your complete answer to that question.
And Robin, that's a terrific lead into the next question, which was, so how did PCORI choose the members of the methodology committee? And it sounds like they rotate, so how does that happen? Does it include patients, and where does the committee get its training in methods and standards?
Yeah.
Well, this was in some sense, it was in the hands of what they're not chosen by PCORI. They're chosen by the GAO, the General Accounting Office. And if one looks at the legislation, you can see the range of expertise that was legislatively mandated to be represented on the committee. The representation of patient perspectives at PCORI is not done on the methodology committee per se. That's done at the level of the Board of Governors. That said, there are a number of folks on the methodology committee, I would say Robin among them, who have spent their careers at the interface between the researchers and patients. And so we do have folks who are very engaged in research, in that space. But I think the GAO looked for, the sort of things we all look for when they pick members, which is, reputation, publishing, expertise, stature in the community within the many areas that they were trying to find experts. And folks can actually, when people rotate off periodically, the GAO conducts researches for new members. And they do that from those who are both nominated by others, but also those who are self-nominated. So I think the calls for those are found maybe both on the PCORI website, but certainly in the Federal Register. I'm not sure about that. Maybe David or Robin knows. But that's how the members are chosen. It's out of our hands, except we have told them areas where we feel that we need representation that sometimes aren't in the legislation. And one area in particular in the next round I think that we're going to get is more expertise in the area of informatics, which is in the area of these research networks that PCORI is now setting up.
Steve, I just also want to mention the question about our patients. So there is not a patient on the methodology committee, but what I do want to mention that we didn't discuss today is PCORI highly values engagement, and to that end there are a number of advisory panels. There are advisory panels with patients and stakeholders and scientists that advise PCORI on research priorities in each of the portfolios, number one. And most recently, about a month ago, the Clinical Trials Advisory Panel was charged, as well as a Rare Diseases Panel. And they will intersect with the Methodology Committee around methods, and there are patients and stakeholders that are represented on those groups. So those groups come from also self-nominations, but they are selected through the PCORI network. The appointments to the Board of Governors or the Methodology Committee do come from the GAO, but the advisory panels are an area where one can engage and self-nominate.
Yes, thank you. That's an important addition.
Great. Yes, thanks. Another question. So does PCORI create standards or methods for how study results get integrated into clinical guidelines? So we're kind of looking at the other side of the equation. Once there's enough evidence for something, are there standards or methodologies considered by PCORI for the clinical services end?
The simple answer to that is no. We're a little bit more involved in how the research is done and reported that we're funding. Exactly how the research is used, which is rarely just how one study is used, it's really how a body of evidence is used and incorporated into guidelines, is certainly a very, very important area A lot of work has been done on that. There's an excellent IOM, Institute of Medicine report on that. But that's really up to the various bodies that do that. ARC funds methodologic work related to guidelines. But we don't, because we're not funding guidelines specifically, and because PCORI isn't engaged exactly in that activity, we're not issuing guidelines in that area specifically, although of course we hope it's done well and done right by the entities that do prepare the guidelines, which is often professional societies, as well as various advisory boards like the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, et cetera.
Yes, our specific charge by statute was development of methodology standards for the conduct of patient-centered outcomes research or comparative clinical effectiveness research. So we have stuck to that charge directly from the legislation.
Great, thanks very much. So that actually ends our time. I'm going to wrap us up by thanking the three of you, David, Robin, and Steve. Thank you very much for an excellent report out for us. Your audience was mixed. It was about half of patient advocates and half researchers and people from the community who are very interested in this topic. You, the audience, can get a copy of this report from the PCORI website. And or we'll be happy to send you the PDF since we've dog-eared a PDF if that's possible. I want to call your attention to the fact that our next webinar is Tuesday, June 17th at noon, and it's on Mini Sentinel. This series of measures and methodologies, standards are introducing a lot of different kinds of standards, measures, methodologies to the community, and we're trying to give you a good overview of what's available. If you have ideas about what we should present, please feel free to send those to us. We're happy to tee up some more webinars. I think we're into September now with the next ones. So again, thanks very much to our presenters, to our audience for great questions. This is recorded, and you may download the recording and the slides in about a week. You'll receive an email message. In fact, we can even attach the report to the email message so that everybody can get it as well. Again, thank you very much.